Charles Darwin visited Australia in 1836. This series of presentations recounts that visit. They have been assembled by the husband and wife team of Frank and Jan Nicholas. Frank, that's me, is an emeritus professor of animal genetics in the Sydney School of Veterinary Science within the University of Sydney. Jan is a retired librarian who worked for some time in the State Library of New South Wales, where she became familiar with many of the works of art that enhance these videos. As explained in the last of these 9 presentations, in 1983 we became engrossed in collecting all relevant information about Charles Darwin's visit to Australia. We are very pleased to acknowledge the many sources of invaluable information, text and images used in these presentations. The source of each item is acknowledged in the relevant slide in the presentations. By far our greatest source is the State Library of New South Wales, incorporating the Mitchell Library, the Dixon Library and the Dixon Gallery. The National Library of Australia provided 3 important paintings. Hank Eaves, an art collector and gallery owner from Melbourne, provided us with access to illustrations by John Gould. A private owner enabled us to reproduce a very significant Conrad Martens painting. And we are particularly grateful to an anonymous donor from Melbourne who contacted the University of Sydney in October 1985, advising that they would like to make sufficient funds available to enable the many relevant works of art to be printed in colour in the book we were by then contemplating. We are especially grateful to that person, whose identity is still unknown to us. The book, entitled, you guessed it, Charles Darwin in Australia, was published by Cambridge University Press in 1989, with a paperback edition in 2002 and a second hardcover edition in 2008. Although our initial research was in the pre-internet days, we can now make use of 2 invaluable websites, as mentioned in the previous presentation. The first is Darwin Online, created by John Van Wy in 2002 and in its present form in 2006. The second is the Darwin Correspondence Project, which was started in Cambridge in 1974 by Frederick and Anne Burkhardt and Sidney Smith, and which disbanded in 2022, having transcribed, annotated, computerized and published in 30 hardback volumes, something like 15,000 letters written by or to Darwin. Our story begins in 1831, the year in which HMS Beagle began its second expedition, under the command of Captain Robert Fitzroy. Here's a sketch of Fitzroy as he looked a few months before arriving in Australia. It is by Philip Gidley King Jr., who was a midshipman on that voyage and who happened to be the son of Philip Parker King, who commanded the Beagle's first surveying voyage. Philip Parker King was also the son of the 3rd Governor of the Colony of New South Wales, Philip Gidley King Sr. Philip Parker King was born on Norfolk Island, was therefore a child of the colony. After many years' service in the Royal Navy, and after farewelling the Beagle at the start of its second surveying voyage in 1831, Philip Parker King returned to the colony in 1832, settling on a farm west of Sydney. We shall meet up with him later in this story. How did Darwin come to be on the voyage? Knowing that the captain of the Beagle on its previous voyage had committed suicide in the captain's cabin, Fitzroy was well aware of the loneliness of a commander on a small vessel during a very long voyage, and could see the great benefit of having on board a companion who he, that is Fitzroy, would regard as a social equal and who would be outside the chain of naval command. Consequently, he wrote to Professor Peacock at Cambridge, seeking suggestions for a, quote, well-educated and scientific person, unquote, who would be willing and able to be a companion to Fitzroy on the voyage. Peacock named the young Charles Darwin. Darwin was born in Shrewsbury in 1809, the second son of a successful medical doctor. When 16 years old, he went to Edinburgh University to study medicine. He stayed there for 2 years, gaining valuable knowledge of biology and geology, but realised he was not cut out to be a medical doctor. Consequently, he followed the well-worn path for people of his social background, going to Cambridge to do a BA degree as a first step to becoming an ordained clergyman. Not long after graduating, he was the person nominated by Peacock, who had been one of Darwin's mentors at Cambridge. There is a very important point that needs to be mentioned here. In his autobiography, Darwin makes it very clear that at the start of the voyage, he accepted the then conventional wisdom as interpreted from Genesis, which he had absorbed at Cambridge, that each species of plant and animal had been created independently. In other words, at the start of the voyage, Darwin had no preconceived ideas that life could have evolved. This point should be made by anyone who teaches a course on evolution. What was the purpose of the voyage? In Darwin's own words, the object of the expedition was to complete the survey of Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego, commenced under Captain King, that's Philip Parker King, in 1826 to 1830, to survey the shores of Chile, Peru, and of some islands in the Pacific, and to carry a chain of chronometrical measurements around the world. Darwin's mention of a chain of chronometrical measurements requires some explanation. For many centuries, the estimation of longitude had been a major challenge for mariners, to the extent that in 1714 the English government announced a prize of up to £20,000, well over £1 million in today's money, to anyone who could come up with a reliable method. The key to the prize-winning solution was a clock, a chronometer, that could maintain accurate time during long sea voyages. Here is one of the chronometers that was actually on the Beagle's second voyage. It is suspended securely in its box to minimise the effects of a tossing ship. With the chronometer set to the time at an arbitrary location called the prime meridian, equivalent to 0 degrees longitude, which was chosen to be Greenwich on the Thames in London, and knowing that the Earth rotates 360 degrees of longitude every 24 hours, the longitude at any point on the Earth's surface could be calculated from the difference in time between local noon, that is when the sun is at its highest, and Greenwich time, read from the chronometer. Keenly aware that no two chronometers will keep exactly the same time, and that some chronometers are bound to break down during a long sea voyage, Fitzroy went to considerable trouble to obtain 22 chronometers for the start of this voyage. The chain of chronometrical measurements around the globe mentioned by Darwin refers to the Admiralty's instructions to Fitzroy to come home to England from South America by heading west, so as to circumnavigate the Earth. This would enable the ultimate test of Fitzroy's longitude estimations. Fitzroy knew that when he finished the voyage and took the chronometers back to Greenwich, the longitude estimation should sum to 360 degrees or 24 hours. How close to 24 hours did Fitzroy get? All will be revealed in the fifth presentation. Why did the Beagle come to Australia? Well, the answer is here in the Admiralty's instructions to Fitzroy. From Tahiti, the Beagle should proceed to Port Jackson, touching at some of the intervening islands in order to divide the run into judicious chronometer stages. For the observatory at Parramatta, being absolutely determined in longitude, all those intervening islands will become standard points to which future casual voyagers will be able to refer their discoveries or correct their chronometers. From Port Jackson, her course will depend on the time of the year. If it be made by the southward, she might touch at Hobart Town, King George Sound and Swan River to determine the difference of longitude from thence to the Mauritius, avoiding the hurricane months, to Table or Simon's Bay according to the season, to St Helena, Ascension and home. So we can now see why the Beagle came to Australia. In circumnavigating the globe, Fitzroy was to estimate longitude at as many locations across the Pacific Ocean as possible, including Port Jackson, Sydney, Hobart and King George Sound, where the city of Albany now is. Importantly, he was to compare his estimate of the longitude of Parramatta, which is just west of Sydney, because that was the location of an astronomical observatory at which longitude had been estimated by the only other method of that time, namely via astronomical observations. This was why Parramatta was regarded as, quote, being absolutely determined in longitude, unquote. As it happens, most of the Admiralty's instructions to Fitzroy were written by Francis Beaufort, who had been appointed hydrographer of the Navy just 2 years previously. Reflecting his particular interest in the weather, Beaufort's instructions to Fitzroy included the following. Meteorological registers may be of use in a variety of ways, but then they must be steadily and accurately kept. At the top of Beaufort's list were daily barometer readings and daily temperature readings of both sea and air. In the next paragraph, Beaufort stated, in this register, the state of the wind and weather will of course be inserted, but some intelligible scale should be assumed to indicate the force of the former, that is, of the wind, instead of the ambiguous terms fresh, moderate, etc., in using which no two people agree. As you may have guessed by now, here we have the birth of the Beaufort wind scale. And here we have what is probably the first printed version of the Beaufort wind scale, as it appeared in Fitzroy's official account of the voyage, published in 1839. So we have figures to denote the force of the wind. 0 is calm, 1 is light air, 2 light breeze, 1 to 2 knots, 3 gentle breeze, 3 to 4 knots, and so on, until we come right down the bottom to 12, hurricane, or that which no canvas could withstand. So Darwin's Beagle voyage was actually the first occasion when the Beaufort wind scale was used officially to record the strength of the wind. And it was not just the force of the wind that interested Beaufort. His instructions to Fitzroy also stated, some concise method should also be employed for expressing the state of the weather. And here we have Beaufort's letters denoting the state of the weather. So we have B for blue skies, C for clouds, D for drizzling rain, etc., all the way down to W for wet dew. And then Beaufort states a dot under any letter indicates an extraordinary degree. And then he importantly states that by the combination of these letters, all the ordinary phenomena of the weather may be expressed with facility and brevity. As it turns out, Fitzroy was the perfect person to whom such instructions could have been given. For every day of the almost 5 years of the voyage, Fitzroy did exactly as Beaufort had instructed, meticulously recording the wind and the weather. The result is an extraordinary record of global weather across almost 5 years, from December 1831 to November 1836, including daily records of barometric pressure, sea and air temperature, the force of the wind, according to the Beaufort scale, and the state of the weather. All of these records were published in 1839 in 62 tabulated pages of the appendix to Fitzroy's account of the Beagle's second voyage. An amazing achievement. One final point. In later life, Fitzroy was instrumental in establishing synoptic weather charts and daily weather forecasts. Viewed in this light, we can say that Beaufort's instruction for the Beagle's second voyage provided excellent training for Fitzroy. As already mentioned, another person on board the Beagle's second surveying voyage was Philip Gidley King Jr., shown here in a sketch by his father, that is Philip Parker King, during the Beagle's first surveying voyage. Philip Gidley Jr. was born in Parramatta, west of Sydney. At age 5, he went to England with his father and sailed with his father on the Beagle's first voyage from 1826 to 1830, when he was aged between 8 and 12. As we shall see, he left the Beagle's second voyage at Sydney and returned to his parents, who were then, as already mentioned, living on a farm west of Sydney. Philip Gidley King Jr. later spent 30 years with the Australian Agricultural Company. He became a member of the New South Wales Parliament and president of the Australian Club. As we shall also see, he and Darwin maintained a correspondence for many years. In his 70s, Philip Gidley King Jr. was asked to draw from memory some diagrams of the Beagle. This is the first of them, showing a cutaway side view of the ship. Here's the captain's cabin, where Fitzroy and Darwin shared meals. Here's the poop cabin, where Darwin slept in a hammock and spent much of his time. Here's the midshipmen's berths. And here's the quarterdeck, command central of the ship. And here we have an indication of the size of the Beagle. It was only 27 metres long. For comparison, here is a modern Sydney ferry. And here is the Beagle, which was 8 metres shorter than the ferry. Here is P.G. King's view of the Beagle's quarterdeck, looking towards the poop cabin. Here's the skylight over the captain's cabin, immediately in front of the ship's wheel. And here's the door into the poop cabin. And here is King's plan of the poop cabin. First, we have the chart table in the middle. Next, we have Mr. Darwin's drawer. Then Mr. Darwin's chair. Then Stokes' chair, and we'll meet Stokes a little bit later on. Then Philip Gidley King's chair. And then the WC, the toilet outside. And finally, the all-important library. For obvious reasons, it was standard practice for surveying voyages to have an artist on board. As Fitzroy explained in his account of the voyage, quote, "Knowing well that no one actively engaged in surveying duties on which we were going to be employed would have time, even if he had ability, to make much use of the pencil, I engaged an artist, Mr. Augustus Earle, to go out in a private capacity, though not without the sanction of the Admiralty, who authorised him also to be victualled." Unquote. Earle had had an eventful life. In 1824, he'd been on a ship travelling from Rio de Janeiro to Cape Town, which stopped at Tristan da Cunha, an island in the South Atlantic Ocean, with, at that time, only 6 adult residents. Earle went sketching with his faithful dog, and the ship sailed without them. Here he is in a self-portrait, sitting with his dog, gazing out to sea, waiting for a passing ship to rescue them. 8 months later, Earle was rescued by the Admiral Coburn, which happened to be on its way to Van Diemen's Land. Thus, in early 1825, Earle found himself in Hobart. A few months later, he went to Sydney, where he was based for more than 3 years with a studio at 10 George Street. By 1830, he was back in England, where he published a book entitled Views in New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land. No doubt these achievements were instrumental in him being appointed artist on the Beagle's second voyage. we shall make use of some of Earl's Australian artwork in illustrating Darwin's comments. On the list of supernumeraries was also a man described here, in Fitzroy's account, that is, at the end of the voyage, as Mr. Darwin's servant. As Darwin records in his diary of the Beagle voyage, Sims Covington was appointed initially as fiddler and boy to poop cabin, that is, an entertainer and servant to everyone in the poop cabin. In the middle of 1833, Covington was appointed by Fitzroy as Darwin's servant, enabling Darwin to say in a letter to his sister Catherine that, quote, "I shall now make a fine collection in birds and quadrupeds, which before took up far too much time." Unquote. One of the striking features of the main characters in our story is their relatively young ages when the Beagle's second voyage began. Fitzroy, for example, was only 26. Charles Darwin was 22. Darwin's servant, that is Covington, was 18. Philip Gidley King was 14. And Augustus Earle was a relatively old man of 38. Also, notice the names John Lord Stokes, whose chair we've already met in the poop cabin. And finally, John Clements Wickham. We shall encounter these two shipmates later in our story. Unfortunately, as Fitzroy recorded, by the time the Beagle had reached Montevideo in South America, quote, "Mr. Earle suffered so much from continual ill health that he could not remain on board the Beagle after August 1832." Unquote. Roughly 12 months later, it just so happened that another English artist, Conrad Martins, was in Rio de Janeiro and heard that Fitzroy was still looking for a replacement artist. Martins quickly travelled to Montevideo and, as Fitzroy records, I quote, "The disappointment caused by losing Mr. Earle's services was diminished by meeting Mr. Martins at Montevideo and engaging him to embark with me as my draftsman." Unquote. And here in this slide we have a Martins self-portrait sketched on the Beagle in June 1834, roughly 8 months after he had joined the ship. A few months before Martins had been appointed, Fitzroy had purchased a second ship with his own funds to increase the effectiveness of his surveying. Immediately he wrote to the Admiralty seeking their approval and recompense for his purchase and the additional costs. There being no emails back then, it took around 20 months before Fitzroy received a response from the Admiralty, by which time the two ships had reached Valparaiso on the western coast of South America. The response from the Admiralty was not what Fitzroy had hoped. His purchase was not approved, and he would not be recompensed. A dispirited Fitzroy was obliged to sell the second ship and pay off some of the crew, including Martins. Determined to make the best of a bad thing, Martins decided to cross the Pacific Ocean and try his luck in Australia. Accordingly, Fitzroy wrote a reference for Martins to Captain Philip Parker King, whom, as we have seen, was settled near Sydney and, being the son of a former governor of the colony, had the sort of connections that should generate commissions for Martins. Also, as we have seen, Fitzroy knew King well, having served under him in the latter part of the Beagle's first surveying voyage. Armed with Fitzroy's reference, Martins arrived in Sydney in April 1835, just a few months before the Beagle, and he stayed there for the rest of his life, becoming one of the colony's leading artists. Thus, Martins' early Australian sketches and paintings provide contemporary illustrations of what Darwin saw when he and the Beagle visited Sydney. The final thing to mention is that we have 5 major sources of Darwin's writing about his visit to Australia. The first is the notebook, in which he recorded his immediate impressions while on the move. The second is the Beagle Diary, written up when back on the Beagle. The third is Journal of Researches, published in 1839 as the third volume of the official account of the voyage, with the second edition in 1845 as a separate book, after the first edition had become a bestseller. The notebook formed the basis of the diary, which in turn formed the basis of the Journal of Researches. There was also the Australian section of the Geological Diary, especially important for Hobart. Finally, there are the letters written by Darwin during his stay in Australia. When we did the research for this story back in the 1980s, it was a very challenging task to obtain copies of all the relevant sections of these 5 sources. Some of them had to be transcribed by Jan, a very challenging task. Now, in the age of the internet, it is entirely different. The original text and definitive annotated transcriptions of all of Darwin's notebooks and the Beagle Diary are now available from John Van Wy's marvellous Darwin online website, as are complete copies of both editions of the Journal of Researches and a definitive annotated transcription of the Geological Diary. Also, as mentioned previously, the original text and first-rate transcriptions of all of Darwin's correspondence are now freely available from the Darwin Correspondence Project website. In the following presentations, we will make extensive use of material from these 2 invaluable websites. We are now ready to commence Charles Darwin's 1836 guided tour of Australia. Having crossed the Pacific Ocean from South America, the Beagle spent Christmas 1835 in New Zealand. It then headed further west, arriving in Sydney on the 12th of January 1836. While the Beagle was in port in Sydney, Darwin took a horseback trip to the inland town of Bathurst. The Beagle then sailed to Hobart, where Darwin celebrated his 27th birthday. By now firmly on its homeward journey, the Beagle sailed westward to King George Sound, its final port of call in Australia. The next presentation details Darwin's arrival in Sydney.